It's 2 a.m. on a frozen morning in the Hürtgen Forest, November 1944. The guns have fallen silent. Then, through the darkness, a sound drifts across no man's land that makes every German soldier's blood run cold. Not artillery, not aircraft, music. Lili Marlene.
Wie einst Lili Marlene.
The song every Wehrmacht soldier knows by heart. The song that reminds them of home, of girls waiting in lamplit doorways, of a world before this frozen hell. And then a voice, speaking perfect German, intimate, almost friendly. Kameraden, your families are listening to this same song tonight. On the radio, in warm homes, they believe you're still alive. But your officers know the truth. Tomorrow morning, the Americans attack. Overwhelming force. Your company will cease to exist by noon. You know this. Your officers know this. Why should you be the last man to die for a lost cause? In a bunker 200 meters away, Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, 19 years old, 3 months on the front, listens. His hands are shaking. Not from cold, from the accuracy of what he's just heard, because American intelligence briefed that loudspeaker team perfectly. Tomorrow morning, there is an attack planned. His unit is undermanned and undersupplied, and he is terrified. This is psychological warfare, the weapon you've never heard of, the strangest, most surreal, most bizarrely ineffective, yet occasionally devastating tool of World War II. How did the greatest military minds of the 20th century decide that the answer to modern warfare was really loudspeakers playing sad music in the middle of the night? To understand how loudspeakers ended up on the front lines of the most mechanized war in history, we have to go back. Back to a time when the entire concept of psychological warfare was viewed as ungentlemanly nonsense. Back to when the only way to defeat an enemy was to kill him. Back to the moment when someone asked, what if we could make them want to surrender? December 1939. A British Army psychiatrist named Major Hugh Sebag Montefiore sits in a War Office basement in London, reading reports from the Polish front. He's looking at casualty figures from the Wehrmacht's invasion. The numbers are staggering, but it's not the numbers that disturb him. It's the surrenders, or rather, the lack of them. Polish units fought to annihilation. German units pushed forward until physically destroyed. The wounded fought until they couldn't hold rifles. Surrender, when it happened at all, came only after catastrophic casualties made resistance literally impossible. Sebag Montefiore circles a number, 87% casualties before capitulation. He writes in the margin, "They're choosing death. Why?" This is the world in 1939. Modern, mechanized, industrial warfare, but with a medieval mindset about surrender. The problem isn't unique to one side. Across every front, every nation, the pattern is the same. Surrender is shameful. Surrender is betrayal. Surrender is weakness. Better to die fighting than live in disgrace. The Japanese have Bushido and will soon demonstrate its most extreme form at places like Saipan and Iwo Jima. The Germans have their Prussian military tradition and the SS oath. The Soviets have Order number 227, not one step back. Even British and American forces, theoretically more pragmatic, view surrender with deep suspicion. The cultural programming runs deep. Officers are trained to fight to the last man. Soldiers are indoctrinated to believe capture is worse than death. Propaganda reinforces these beliefs daily. But here's what the generals are slowly realizing. This mindset is tactically insane. Every soldier who fights to the death takes time, ammunition, and lives to eliminate. A surrounded platoon that refuses to surrender might tie up an entire battalion for days. The Battle of Westerplatte in Poland, fewer than 200 Polish soldiers held out against 3,500 Germans for 7 days. At Brest Fortress, Soviet defenders held out for weeks after the Wehrmacht had moved hundreds of kilometers east. From a purely operational perspective, the refusal to surrender is devastatingly effective for the defender. Major Sebag Montefiore is thinking about this problem from the other angle. What if you could convince enemy soldiers to surrender earlier, before they've inflicted maximum casualties, before they've used up all their ammunition, before they've tied up your forces for days or weeks? What if surrender could be encouraged? But how do you change something as fundamental as a soldier's will to fight? How do you reach into a man's mind, past years of training and cultural conditioning, and convince him that laying down his arms is not just acceptable, it's the rational choice? The British Army has psychologists, they have propagandists, they have radio broadcasts beamed deep into Germany. But these are strategic tools. They reach the home front, the rear echelons, the civilian population. They don't reach the man in the foxhole, the soldier staring across no man's land, the defender in the bunker. Radio requires a radio set. Leaflets require daylight and the risk of being seen reading enemy propaganda. But sound carries. Sound penetrates. Sound reaches men, whether they want to hear it or not. The concept isn't entirely new. During World War I, both sides occasionally shouted across trenches. Christmas truces began with singing. But these were spontaneous, organic, human moments. What Sebag Montefiore and his colleagues are proposing is something different. Industrial-scale psychological warfare. Scientific. Systematic. Amplified. The technology exists. Commercial public address systems can project sound over considerable distances. The Germans have been using loudspeakers for rallies since the early 1930s. The Nuremberg rallies proved you could address crowds of hundreds of thousands with the right equipment. But adapting this for battlefield use presents unique challenges. The speakers need to be powerful enough to project over artillery and small arms fire, directional enough to focus on enemy positions, durable enough to survive rough handling and weather, portable enough to move with advancing forces, protected enough that enemy fire doesn't destroy them immediately. And even if you solve all these technical problems, there's a deeper question. What do you say? What the British theorists don't yet know is that someone else has already been conducting experiments. On the Eastern Front, Soviet propaganda units have been mounting loudspeakers on trucks and playing messages at German positions since late 1941. The results are complicated. Sometimes Germans surrender in droves. Sometimes they open fire on the speakers with everything they have. And sometimes, this is the part that will fascinate psychological warfare theorists for the rest of the war. The German soldiers simply sit in their positions and listen, weapons ready, neither surrendering nor shooting. What makes the difference? The Soviets are trying to figure it out, and their findings are about to change how every major power approaches battlefield propaganda. But first, the equipment has to work. March 1942. A Bell Laboratories engineer named Harold Burris Meyer stands in a New Jersey field, screaming at a cow. He's not having a breakdown. This is science. The cow, a Holstein named Bessie, according to the farm records, stands 400 meters away, chewing cud, completely unbothered. Burris Meyer adjusts the angle of the massive horn-shaped speaker array behind him, takes a breath, and tries again. "Attention, German soldiers! You are surrounded. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Bessie looks up, stops chewing. Boris Meyer grins. The microphone picks it up. Gentlemen, I believe we have achieved bovine compliance. The Wehrmacht should be considerably easier. It will not be easier. Welcome to the most surreal research and development program of World War II. While other engineers are building radar, proximity fuses, and atomic bombs, a small group of acoustic specialists is trying to solve a problem that sounds simple. How do you make someone 500 meters away hear you clearly enough to understand complex sentences, while both of you are being shot at? The US Army establishes the Psychological Warfare Branch in 1942 and immediately dumps the problem in the laps of Bell Labs and Western Electric. These companies know sound. They built the telephone network after all. But telephones work because both parties have receivers. This is different. This is acoustic broadcasting into open air, over distance, through weather, often with active interference. The Germans, meanwhile, are ahead of the curve. They've been using loudspeakers since the Soviet front opened. Their standard setup, the Tornister Lautsprecher, a backpack-mounted system that can project voice up to 200 meters. Decent for trench-to-trench communication, useless for anything more ambitious. The Soviets go bigger, much bigger. They mount massive speakers on trucks, American-made Studebakers, ironically, supplied via Lend-Lease. These sound trucks can project at distances up to 800 meters under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions don't exist on the Eastern Front. Wind, rain, snow, artillery fire, all of it degrades the message. And then there's the fundamental physics problem. Sound attenuates with the square of the distance. Double the distance, you need 4 times the power. Want to reach 1,000 meters instead of 500? You need quadruple the amplification. This isn't a problem you solve with better microphones. You need raw power. Bell Labs approaches it like an engineering challenge. Maximize efficiency, minimize distortion, optimize for voice frequencies. They develop the T17 sound projector set, a beast of a system that requires a 250-watt amplifier, enormous for the era, 8 separate horn speakers in a directional array, a gasoline-powered generator, a team of 4 operators, a truck or jeep to transport it all. Total weight, 850 pounds of equipment. But here's the genius of the design. It's modular. You can run 1 speaker for close-range work, or connect all 8 for maximum range. The horns are adjustable. Angle them up for distance, down for nearby targets. And the directional array means most of your sound energy goes where you want it, not spreading uselessly in all directions. In tests at Fort Myer, Virginia, the T-17 achieves intelligible voice transmission at 1,200 meters, in perfect conditions, with no background noise, and a trained operator speaking clearly at optimal volume. The British, characteristically, take a different approach. They already have experience with public address systems from air raid warnings. Their amplifier unit number 7 is simpler, lighter, more portable. It only reaches 600 meters maximum, but it can be set up by 2 men in under 5 minutes. The Americans want power. The British want practicality. Both will discover they need something else entirely, content that actually works. Because here's what the engineers don't initially understand. Perfect audio fidelity doesn't matter if what you're saying makes soldiers want to kill you more, not surrender. The Psychological Warfare Branch starts training operator teams in early 1943. These aren't typical soldiers. They need to be fluent in German, Italian, or Japanese, trained in voice projection and radio technique, capable of field repairs on complex electronics, brave enough, or crazy enough, to broadcast enemy-facing messages while under fire. Captain Daniel Lerner, a sociologist from Stanford, runs the German language training program. He quickly discovers that native German speakers don't necessarily make good propaganda broadcasters. Some are too angry, Jewish refugees who can't keep the rage out of their voices. Others are too sympathetic, German Americans who inadvertently make the enemy sound reasonable. We need people who can sound like a concerned friend, Lerner writes in his training manual. Not a hectoring enemy, not a sympathetic relative. A pragmatic comrade who's telling you the truth you already know but haven't admitted to yourself. They practice for hours. Tone, pacing, emotional inflection. The goal is to sound intimate despite the massive amplification. To sound human despite the mechanical reproduction. To sound credible despite being, objectively, enemy propaganda. And then there's the music selection. This becomes its own specialized field. What songs evoke nostalgia without inspiring defiance? What melodies remind soldiers of home without reminding them what they're fighting for? Lili Marlene becomes the gold standard. It's popular with both German and Allied forces. It's melancholy without being maudlin. It speaks to universal soldier experiences: waiting, longing, uncertainty. And crucially, it's been recorded by performers on both sides. You can play Marlene Dietrich's version, German-born but now in Hollywood, or Lael Anderson's original German recording. The Soviets, meanwhile, discover that German soldiers respond strongly to classical music. Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert. These trigger powerful emotional responses. The propaganda units start their broadcasts with 15 minutes of German classical music. Let it wash over the enemy positions, soften the psychological defenses, then gradually introduce the spoken messages. It's manipulation, obviously. But it's manipulation based on genuine psychological research and careful observation of what actually works. By mid-1943, loudspeaker teams are deploying with American forces in North Africa. British units are preparing systems for the inevitable invasion of Italy. Soviet units have dozens of sound trucks operating across the Eastern Front. The equipment is ready. The operators are trained. The scripts are written. Now comes the hard part, using them in actual combat. Where the enemy shoots back, where the messages have to work on men who are scared, exhausted, indoctrinated, and surrounded by their comrades who will judge them for even listening. The first major test comes in Sicily, July 1943. An American loudspeaker team approaches German positions on the slopes of Mount Etna. The operator, Staff Sergeant Martin Selling, a Jewish refugee from Berlin, sets up his equipment 400 meters from enemy lines. He's sweating despite the early morning chill. He checks the connections, powers up the system, adjusts the horns to angle toward the German bunkers, takes a breath, and then, in flawless Berlin-accented German, begins the broadcast that will define psychological warfare doctrine for the next 80 years. Guten Morgen, Kameraden. My name is Martin. I'm speaking to you from Berlin, or rather, I was from Berlin, before 1938. I know what you've been told about us. I know what you believe. But right now, in this moment, I'm the only man on this mountain who's actually trying to keep you alive. What happens next will shock everyone, including Martin Selling. Staff Sergeant Martin Selling is 30 seconds into his broadcast when the German machine guns open up. Not at his position. At him personally. Tracers arc through the morning air, converging on the loudspeaker array. The first burst misses, the second doesn't. One speaker horn disintegrates in a shower of sparks and shredded metal. Selling doesn't stop talking. That's Maschinengewehr 42 fire, in case you're wondering. About 1,200 rounds per minute. Very impressive. Very loud. But Kameraden, I can still hear you. And more importantly, some of you can still hear me. The machine gun fire stops. This is the moment. The weird, improbable, completely insane moment when psychological warfare actually works. Selling continues. His voice is calm, almost conversational, despite the massive amplification. He's not reading from a script. He's talking to soldiers he can't see, who are just trying to kill him in a language that marks him as either a traitor or a victim, depending on your perspective. Your lieutenant is probably screaming at the machine gunner right now, telling him to destroy my equipment, not waste ammunition. Smart officer. But here's what he knows, and you're starting to figure out. Every shot fired at me is a shot that tells your position to American artillery observers. Every tracer is a beacon. You've just told them exactly where you are. In the German positions, Obergefreiter Klaus Huber, 21 years old, conscripted from a farm outside Munich, listens. His lieutenant is indeed screaming at the machine gunner, and the gunner has stopped firing. Because what the voice said is true. They're exposed now. Selling shifts tone, softer, more personal. Some of you are thinking about home right now, about who's waiting. My mother is in Brooklyn now. She got out in 1939. My father didn't. Neither did my little sister Rachel. She was 12. I don't know where they are now. The Red Cross can't tell me. Maybe you don't know where your families are either. Maybe your city was bombed. Maybe you haven't had mail in weeks. I know that feeling, Kameraden. I know it very well. It's manipulative, it's calculated, it's also completely sincere. And that combination, professional propaganda delivery mixed with genuine emotion, creates something powerful. Here's what I can tell you, what the Red Cross confirmed for me. In American POW camps you get 3 meals a day, real food, not sawdust bread, medical care, actual doctors, antibiotics if you need them, male privileges. You can write home. Let them know you're alive. Work if you want it. Pay even. 80 cents a day under Geneva Convention rules. Safety. No air raids, no artillery. No more watching your friends die. This is the formula that Selling and his team have refined through dozens of broadcasts. Don't threaten. Don't insult. Don't question their courage. Instead, offer detailed, specific, verifiable information about what surrender actually means. Make it concrete, make it real. And then, the tactical intelligence. This is what separates effective propaganda from mere noise. I'm going to tell you something your officers already know. At 0800 hours, 42 minutes from now, American artillery is going to open fire on your position. Coordinates have already been transmitted. The forward observer can see you right now. You're still visible from that machine gun burst. After 30 minutes of bombardment, 2 companies of American infantry will advance. You're outnumbered 4-1. You have no air support. Your supply line was cut yesterday when the Canadians took the crossroads at Radusa. Klaus Huber's hands tighten on his rifle. Because this is accurate, all of it. Their supply trucks didn't arrive yesterday. The lieutenant has been rationing ammunition since dawn. And there was heavy fighting to the north. Everyone heard it. How does the enemy know this? How does he know their exact situation? Selling provides the answer. The Wehrmacht is a professional army. You know when a position is untenable. Your officers know. High command knows. They're already falling back to the next defensive line. But they haven't told you yet, have they? Because if you knew the plan was to delay us here while the main force retreats, you might question why you should die for a delay. This is psychological warfare at its most effective. Tell soldiers information that changes their understanding of their tactical situation. Not lies, not exaggerations. Verifiable truth delivered at a moment when it creates maximum doubt. You have two options. Option 1, stay in your positions, survive the artillery barrage if you can, fight the American attack, maybe hold for a few hours, die or surrender anyway when you run out of ammunition. Option 2, display white flags now. Walk forward with hands raised. Survive today. Write home tomorrow. See the end of this war. The silence from the German positions is absolute. No fire. No movement. Just waiting. Selling makes his final play. Music. He nods to his assistant, who starts the phonograph. Lili Marlene drifts across the mountain slope. Scratchy, melancholy, heartbreaking. Underneath the lamplight by the barrack gate. 3 minutes pass. 4. The Americans in the positions behind Selling are watching through binoculars, weapons ready, unsure whether this is working or about to get them all killed. Then a white undershirt appears on a stick, then another. Then 5 more. 17 German soldiers walk out of their positions with hands raised. Klaus Huber is the 3rd man out. He's crying. He'll survive the war, return to his farm, and live to age 83. He'll tell his grandchildren about the morning. A voice from a loudspeaker saved his life. The American lieutenant in charge of Selling's protective detail is stunned. Did that actually work? Selling is packing up his equipment, hands shaking from adrenaline. 17 out of probably 40? That's a 42% surrender rate. If we'd assaulted that position, we'd have taken 30% casualties minimum. So yeah, Lieutenant. It worked. The success at Mount Etna isn't unique. Across Sicily, loudspeaker teams achieve varying results. Near Palermo, 23 Italian soldiers surrender after a 45-minute broadcast. Outside Catania, 0 surrenders, but captured Germans later report the broadcast lowered morale significantly. At Gela, an entire German platoon, 41 men, surrenders after hearing accurate predictions about an American tank attack. But here's the critical statistic that the psychological warfare branch will analyze obsessively. The average surrender rate when loudspeakers are used is 7 to 12%. That sounds low, but compare it to the baseline surrender rate of 2 to 3% in equivalent situations without loudspeaker intervention, and suddenly you're looking at a weapon that triples or quadruples surrender rates. For every 100 soldiers who hear the message, 7 to 12 choose life over death. That's 7 to 12 men who don't have to be killed. 7 to 12 positions that don't have to be assaulted. 7 to 12 sources of intelligence about enemy dispositions. From a purely actuarial perspective, loudspeaker propaganda is cost-effective. Each T-17 system costs roughly $2,800. If it produces even 5 additional surrenders, preventing 5 assaults that would have cost lives and ammunition, it pays for itself. But the success in Sicily creates a dangerous illusion that this method is reliably effective, that it can be systematized, that with the right script and the right delivery, you can predictably convince enemy soldiers to surrender. The campaigns in Italy are about to shatter that illusion completely. September 1943. Salerno Beachhead. Another loudspeaker team, another carefully crafted broadcast, another group of German defenders. The operator, Corporal Heinrich Fischer, Austrian, not Jewish, volunteered for propaganda work to avoid combat, sets up his system and begins broadcasting. Soldiers of the 16th Panzer Division, you are defending an untenable position. The German response is not surrender. It's not gunfire, it's laughter. Actual, audible, mocking laughter from the German positions, followed by their own loudspeaker broadcast in heavily accented English. Hello, Tommy and Yankee friends. Thank you for the entertainment. We too have loudspeakers. Should we also talk? Here is German music for you. Maybe you will surrender instead, yeah? And then, blasting across the battlefield from German positions, the opening notes of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. The psychological warfare game just became a contest, and the Germans are about to prove they can play it too. October 1943. The Volturno River, northern Italy. An American loudspeaker team on the South Bank broadcasts surrender appeals to German positions on the North Bank. Simultaneously, a German loudspeaker unit broadcasts surrender appeals to American positions. Both sides are offering essentially the same terms: safety, food, medical care, adherence to Geneva Convention protocols. Both sides' soldiers are listening. Both sides' soldiers are confused. One American private, Donald Kern from Ohio, later describes it in a letter home. It was the damnedest thing. We're telling them to quit. They're telling us to quit. And we're all just sitting there, listening to both broadcasts like it's a radio variety show, except with more explosions. Welcome to the most surreal phase of the war, competitive psychological warfare. What happens when both sides have the same weapon and the same basic strategy? Chaos. Mostly. The German propaganda units, organized under Wehrmacht Propaganda Company, have been refining their approach throughout 1943. They have several advantages. More experience. They've been doing this on the Eastern Front since 1941. Better intelligence on American forces. POW interrogations provide endless material. Native English speakers. Captured Americans sometimes voluntarily work for propaganda units, more often under duress. But they also have a critical disadvantage. They're losing the war. The German approach differs from the American in significant ways. Where American broadcasts tend toward rational, evidence-based arguments, your tactical situation is untenable, German broadcasts lean heavily on emotional and ideological appeals. A typical German broadcast to American troops, American soldiers. Why are you dying for Roosevelt's war? Your president sent you here to die for British imperialism. While you fight and bleed in Italy, Roosevelt's Jewish friends in New York and Washington grow rich from war profits. Your families need you. America needs you. Germany has no quarrel with the American people, only with your treacherous government. It's sophisticated propaganda. It's also wildly ineffective. Why? Because it fundamentally misunderstands American soldiers' psychology. The anti-Semitic rhetoric that might resonate with certain European populations falls flat with most Americans. The anti-Roosevelt messaging actually strengthens resolve. American soldiers may gripe about leadership, but they resent enemy propaganda more. But the Germans have one weapon that does work: Axis Sally. Her real name is Mildred Gillars. American-born, aspiring actress, ended up in Germany when the war started. Now she's the voice of Radio Berlin's English-language broadcasts. And while she's primarily a strategic propaganda asset, radio broadcasts to rear areas, her recordings are used by frontline loudspeaker units. Her approach is different. Less ideology, more psychology. She plays American music, current hits that soldiers miss desperately. She reads letters supposedly from American wives and girlfriends, some real, some fabricated, describing infidelities back home. She describes in loving detail the meals, comforts, and safety available to American POWs in Germany. Hi fellas, this is Sally. Hope you're staying warm out there in those foxholes. I'm sitting here in a nice warm studio in Berlin, and I've got a letter from Mrs. Dorothy Henderson of Detroit, Michigan. She writes, "Dear honey, I hope you're staying safe in Italy. The factory where I've been working hired a new supervisor named Frank. He's been very kind, taking me to dinner, helping with the car." Well, fellas, I think we all know where that's going, don't we? It's insidious because it preys on soldiers' deepest insecurities. Not their fear of death. They've already internalized that. But their fear that while they're suffering and sacrificing, life back home continues without them. That they're being forgotten, replaced. American soldiers hate Axis Sally. They also listen obsessively whenever she's broadcast. The official US Army response is to condemn her broadcasts, warn soldiers against listening, and immediately copy the techniques. By early 1944, American psychological warfare units are deploying female broadcasters, German-American women with the right accent, to deliver similar messages to Wehrmacht troops. Gunther, this is Marlene. Not the famous one, the other Marlene from Essen. I want to read you a letter that came through Red Cross channels from Frau Gretel Schmidt in Hamburg. Dear Hans, I write this, hoping it reaches you somehow. The city was bombed again last week. I took the children to the shelter, but our building was hit. I'm now staying with my sister in the countryside. Please, if you can, come home. We need you. The cause is lost. Everyone here knows it now. Save yourself, so we can be a family again. The difference is that American propaganda is supported by actual material superiority. When they promise food and safety, they can deliver it. When they describe the futility of continued resistance, the tactical situation often supports that assessment. German propaganda is aspirational. American propaganda is evidential. But both sides discover the same frustrating truth. Loudspeaker propaganda is most effective against troops who are already wavering. It doesn't create the desire to surrender. It provides permission to act on desires that already exist. The data emerging from Italy is fascinating. Well-supplied, well-led units. 1 to 2% surrender rate regardless of loudspeaker use. Surrounded, undersupplied units. 15 to 20% surrender rate with loudspeakers versus 5 to 7% without. Recently committed replacement troops, 8 to 10% surrender rate with loudspeakers versus 2 to 3% without. Elite units, SS, paratroopers. Less than 1% surrender rate, even with loudspeaker use. What this tells psychological warfare theorists: you can't convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced. But you can help someone who's already questioning find the rationalization they need. The competition between American and German loudspeaker units creates bizarre situations. At Anzio, both sides broadcast almost continuously. Some sectors of the line have 3 or 4 loudspeaker systems operating simultaneously. American, German, British, and sometimes Italian resistance broadcasts from partisans in the hills. Soldiers on both sides report becoming numb to it all. The constant noise, the dueling messages, the competing musical selections. It becomes background noise. The psychological warfare, equivalent of saturation bombing. So much stimulus that the brain simply filters it out. Private Robert Cupper, no relation to the photographer, writes in his diary, "Jerry played Lili Marlene 3 times tonight. We played it 4 times. Then they played Wagner. We played Sinatra. Then they broadcast a whole speech about Roosevelt being a warmonger. Our boys turned off the loudspeakers and just shouted insults across the line in German. honestly more effective. This leads to an evolution in tactics, the short, sharp broadcast. Instead of 20 to 30-minute programs, units start delivering 2 to 3-minute messages at irregular intervals, just enough to penetrate the psychological filters, not enough to become ignorable background noise. And they get creative with timing, broadcasting during dawn stand-to, when soldiers are most alert and most vulnerable psychologically. Broadcasting immediately after artillery barrages, when enemy troops are shaken and receptive. Broadcasting during meal times, emphasizing the contrast between meager field rations and POW camp food. The Soviets, meanwhile, have taken a completely different approach on the Eastern Front. They use loudspeakers not primarily for surrender appeals, but for psychological torture. German positions facing Soviet lines report broadcasts that run 24 hours a day. Not music, not surrender appeals, just sounds. Ticking clocks, counting down to the next Soviet attack, recorded screams from wounded soldiers, the sound of tank engines playing for hours, making it impossible to tell when real tanks are approaching. Messages in German from captured soldiers, sometimes coerced, sometimes voluntary, describing Soviet captivity in graphic detail. Symphonic music mixed with the sounds of artillery fire. Women's voices reading letters from home, accurate enough to be devastating. It's psychological warfare as pure horror. The goal isn't to convince German soldiers to surrender. It's to destroy their sleep, shatter their nerves, make them irrational and ineffective. And it works. Wehrmacht After Action reports from the Eastern Front describe units suffering psychological casualties at rates comparable to physical casualties. Men who can't sleep, can't focus, become combat ineffective without ever being wounded. The Americans and British don't adopt these terror tactics. They're viewed as violations of the laws of war, even if technically legal. But they learn from them. They discover that loudspeakers can be used not just for messages, but for pure psychological effect. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The Battle of the Bulge. German forces have achieved complete surprise and are pushing American lines back in chaos. For the first time in over a year, it's American troops who are surrounded, undersupplied, and desperate. And now it's German loudspeaker teams who approach American positions with offers of surrender, safety, and survival. The Americans are about to experience what they've been doing to the Wehrmacht, and they're about to learn a hard truth. Receiving psychological warfare is much more effective than delivering it. But in one particular sector, near the town of Bastogne, an American loudspeaker team that's been cut off and surrounded is going to try something unprecedented, something that will either get them all killed or become legendary. They're going to broadcast to the Germans, while surrounded, while losing, and somehow make it work. December 22nd, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Victor Weinstein huddles in a frozen cellar with his T-17 loudspeaker system, surrounded by 8 feet of Belgian defensive earthworks and 2 years of psychological warfare experience. His situation is, objectively, insane. The 101st Airborne is completely encircled. No supplies, no reinforcements, no realistic hope of relief. German forces outnumber them, at least 4-1. The weather has grounded all Allied aircraft, and General McAuliffe's famous one-word response to German surrender demands, "Nuts!" is great for morale but doesn't change the tactical mathematics. Weinstein, Jewish kid from the Bronx, fluent German speaker, has a different kind of mathematics running through his head. If we're surrounded, that means the Germans are all around us, which means no matter which direction I point these speakers, I'm broadcasting to enemy positions. Target-rich environment. He grins, runs a hand along the frozen metal of his equipment, and makes a decision that will either get him court-martialed or decorated. He's going to broadcast, not surrender appeals. Something else entirely. What Weinstein understands, what 2 years of psychological warfare work has taught him, is that the content of propaganda matters less than the context. In Sicily, surrounded German soldiers responded to rational surrender appeals because they knew they were losing. But here in Bastogne, the Germans are winning. They're advancing. They've achieved victory after victory over the past week. Why would they surrender? So Weinstein doesn't ask them to. He sets up his system, angles the horns toward the German lines, and begins broadcasting. Not in German, in English, loudly, cheerfully, aggressively. Good morning to the German forces surrounding Bastogne. This is the American 101 Airborne Division broadcasting from the center of town. We hope you're enjoying the Belgian weather. We know we're not, but we wanted to let you know. We're still here, still holding, still waiting for you to try taking this town. In German positions around the perimeter, soldiers stop what they're doing. What is this? Is this a surrender? It doesn't sound like a surrender. We understand you sent our general a surrender demand yesterday. Very polite, very professional. His response, in case you didn't hear it clearly, was nuts, which, for our German friends who don't know American slang, means go to hell. We're not surrendering. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. This is the opposite of every psychological warfare doctrine. You're supposed to offer surrender, not refuse it. You're supposed to emphasize enemy strength, not boast about resistance. You're supposed to demoralize the enemy, not challenge them. But Weinstein knows something else. The German forces surrounding Bastogne are exhausted. They've been fighting since December 16th. They've pushed 60 kilometers into Allied lines. They're at the absolute end of their supply chain. And they were told Bastogne would fall in a day or two. It's been a week. Your officers told you this would be an easy victory. Told you the Americans would run like they ran at Kasserine Pass. Told you we're soft, poorly trained, lacking German fighting spirit. Well, Kameraden, we're still here. Every hour you don't take this town is another hour your attack stalls. Another hour for American reinforcements to arrive. Another hour for the weather to clear so our aircraft can fly. Now he shifts tone, becomes conversational, almost friendly. I'm going to tell you what your officers aren't telling you. The American Third Army is moving north to relieve us. General Patton diverted 3 entire divisions yesterday. They're 80 kilometers south of here right now, covering 15 to 20 kilometers per day. Do the math, Kameraden. In 4 days, maybe 5, they'll be here. And then you're not surrounding us. We're surrounding you. This is psychological warfare judo. Weinstein is using the enemy's tactical success against them. Yes, you've surrounded us. But now you're committed. Now you can't advance until you take this town. And every day you don't take it, your situation gets worse, not better. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to attack again. Maybe today. Maybe tomorrow. You'll take casualties. We'll take casualties. You'll push forward a few streets. We'll push you back. And then Patton arrives, and suddenly you're fighting in 2 directions. He plays music. Not Lili Marlene. The Star-Spangled Banner. Loud, defiant, followed by Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Upbeat, energetic, the psychological opposite of defeat. That's American music, Kameraden. Music from a country with unlimited industrial capacity, unlimited manpower, unlimited resources. We can take losses and replace them. Can you? The Germans don't respond with loudspeakers. They respond with artillery. For 15 minutes, shells hammer the area around Weinstein's position. His team shelters in the cellar, equipment powered down, waiting. When the barrage lifts, Weinstein checks his system. One speaker horn is damaged. The others are functional. He powers up again. Thank you for the artillery demonstration. We appreciate the reminder that you still have ammunition. Must be getting low if you're using it on loudspeakers instead of targets that matter. Tell your officers we said hello. It's insane. It's reckless. It's also working. What Weinstein has done is shift the psychological dynamic. By broadcasting confidence and defiance while surrounded, he's forced the Germans to question their own situation. If the Americans are this confident while losing, what do they know that we don't? Over the next 3 days, Weinstein broadcasts periodically. Each time the message is the same. We're still here. We're not surrendering. Your clock is ticking. And each time, he provides accurate tactical intelligence to back up his claims. Weather forecasts predicting clearing skies from division headquarters, updates on Third Army positions from radio intercepts, lists of German units identified in the encirclement from POW interrogations. The accuracy is devastating. How does the surrounded force have better intelligence than the surrounding force? Because the Americans have intact radio communications. Because Allied intelligence is tracking German movements. Because being surrounded doesn't mean being isolated, not when you have radios. On December 26th, advance elements of Patton's Third Army break through to Bastogne. The siege is lifted. The German offensive stalls. The Battle of the Bulge will continue for another month, but the psychological turning point is here. When German prisoners are interrogated afterward, several mention the American broadcasts from Bastogne. Not as a reason for surrendering, these men fought hard until captured, but as a source of psychological pressure. One Feldwebel from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. We were told the Americans would surrender any day. When they broadcast instead, when they sounded confident, it made us question whether our officers knew what they were talking about. And when Patton did arrive, exactly when they said he would, we realized the Americans had better intelligence than we did. Weinstein receives the Bronze Star. The citation doesn't mention loudspeakers. Military bureaucracy hasn't caught up to psychological warfare yet. It's awarded for meritorious service in connection with military operations. But everyone in the psychological warfare branch knows what he did. He used loudspeakers as a weapon not of persuasion, but of morale warfare. He didn't try to convince Germans to surrender. He tried to convince them they were going to lose. And in doing so, he revealed the deeper truth of psychological warfare. It's most effective when it changes how soldiers think about their situation, not when it tells them what to do. But while Weinstein is achieving unlikely success in the European theater, American psychological warfare units in the Pacific are facing a completely different problem. The Japanese don't surrender. Not at 7 to 12% rates. Not at 2 to 3% rates. Not at measurable rates at all. And when loudspeaker teams try the techniques that worked in Europe, rational appeals, accurate intelligence, offers of safety and food, Japanese soldiers respond with suicide charges. The Pacific War is about to teach psychological warfare specialists the limits of their craft and force them to confront a terrible question. What do you do when the enemy would rather die than listen? February 1945, Iwo Jima. a Navy loudspeaker team aboard a destroyer offshore has been broadcasting surrender appeals to Japanese positions for 3 days. The messages are carefully crafted, translated by Japanese-American linguists, delivered in polite, respectful Japanese. The response rate is 0, not low. 0. Lieutenant Thomas Sakamoto, Nisei, translator from California, watches the island through binoculars. He can see Japanese soldiers. They're clearly hearing the broadcasts. Some look toward the ships when messages play. But none surrender. On the 4th day, Sakamoto tries something different. He broadcasts a message from his own experience. I am Thomas Sakamoto. My parents came from Hiroshima Prefecture. I am American, but I understand Japanese culture. I understand honor. I am telling you, there is no shame in survival when the battle is lost. Your families want you to live. The Japanese response comes not through loudspeakers, but through action. A suicide charge that night. 43 men, all killed. One carries a note found by Marines afterward. We do not listen to traitors. Sakamoto sits on the deck of the destroyer that night, head in his hands. It doesn't work here, he tells his commanding officer. Nothing works here. The Pacific War reveals the absolute limits of loudspeaker propaganda, and in doing so, it exposes uncomfortable truths about psychological warfare that theorists had been avoiding. It doesn't work on everyone. Sometimes it doesn't work at all. The numbers are stark. European theatre, 7 to 12% average surrender rate with loudspeaker use. Eastern Front, Germans facing Soviets, 4 to 8% surrender rate. Pacific theatre, Japanese forces, 0.3% surrender rate, 0.3%, statistically indistinguishable from random chance. Why the dramatic difference? The easy answer is Japanese military culture. The complete answer is more complex and more disturbing. Japanese soldiers in World War II are operating under multiple layers of cultural, military, and ideological conditioning that interact to make surrender nearly impossible. The Emperor's soldiers, they're not fighting for Japan. They're fighting for the Emperor, a divine figure. Surrender is personal betrayal of divinity. The Field Service Code, Senjin-kun, issued 1941, explicitly states, never suffer the shame of being taken alive. Not as advice, as absolute command. Family honor. Surrender brings shame not just to the individual, but to the entire family, including ancestors. Death in battle is honorable. Capture is generational disgrace. Propaganda about Allied treatment. Japanese soldiers are told, repeatedly, that Americans torture and kill prisoners, that surrender means torture, castration, death. Better to die fighting than die slowly in enemy hands. Unit cohesion. Japanese units maintain extremely tight social bonds. Surrendering means abandoning comrades, which violates every principle of military brotherhood. The American psychological warfare units try everything, rational appeals. The war is lost. Your emperor will need living soldiers to rebuild Japan. Response. Suicide charges. Emotional appeals. Your families want you to survive. Response. Suicide charges. Religious appeals. Buddhist principles value life. Response. Suicide charges. Evidence-based appeals. Look at these photos of well-treated Japanese POWs. Response. Assumed to be fake propaganda. Direct orders, broadcasting statements, supposedly from senior Japanese officers ordering surrender. Response. Assumed to be fake propaganda, also suicide charges. The Nisei translators, second-generation Japanese Americans, are particularly valuable and particularly traumatized by this work. They understand the cultural context. They can deliver messages with perfect accent and cultural framing, and they watch it accomplish nothing. Thomas Sakamoto's diary, later donated to the National Archives, includes this entry from Iwo Jima. Today we broadcast for 6 hours, informed Japanese defenders that they were surrounded, that no relief was coming, that continued resistance was futile. We offered food, medical care, honor. We explained Geneva Convention protections. We played Japanese music. We had a captured Japanese officer broadcast a personal appeal. Result: 3 prisoners, all wounded, unconscious men found by Marines. Not one voluntary surrender. How do you conduct psychological warfare against an enemy who views your very existence as propaganda? But there's a deeper problem that Allied commanders are slow to recognize. Japanese soldiers often can't surrender, even if they want to. Unit officers enforce no-surrender policies violently. Multiple accounts from rare Japanese POWs describe officers executing soldiers who suggested surrender. Wounded men who can't fight are often shot by their own comrades to prevent capture. And even if a soldier overcomes all psychological barriers and decides to surrender, the practical mechanics are nearly impossible. American forces, after months of fake surrenders followed by grenade attacks, shoot first. Japanese soldiers who try to surrender are often killed before they can communicate intent. The few Japanese soldiers who do become prisoners usually fit specific profiles: wounded, unconscious, and captured without choice, isolated from their units for days or weeks, psychological conditioning weakened, Korean or Taiwanese conscripts with less ideological commitment, military laborers rather than combat troops. The psychological warfare teams adapt. Since surrender appeals don't work, they shift to different objectives. 1. Tactical deception, broadcasting false information to confuse Japanese commanders. Fake attack schedules, fabricated unit movements, deceptive operational plans. The goal isn't surrender, it's chaos. 2. Sleep deprivation, following the Soviet model, playing sounds 24/7 to deny Japanese troops rest, ticking clocks, machinery noise, random artillery sounds, making defenders exhausted and irrational. 3. Morale degradation, broadcasting accurate information about Japanese defeats elsewhere, about cities bombed, about the strategic situation. Not to convince soldiers to surrender, but to make them understand their sacrifice is meaningless. 4. Cultural warfare. This is the darkest evolution, broadcasting messages designed to create shame, anger, and self-destructive behavior, suggesting that families back home have forgotten soldiers, that political leaders are seeking peace while demanding troops fight to death, that the emperor himself may not know about their suffering. It's psychological warfare as pure weapon, divorced from the humanitarian goal of reducing casualties. The Americans aren't trying to save Japanese lives anymore. They're trying to make Japanese soldiers less effective. And it works better than surrender appeals ever did. Japanese prisoners, rare as they are, increasingly report psychological exhaustion, confusion about the war's purpose, and deep cynicism about their leadership. Not enough to surrender, but enough to become less aggressive, less effective, more prone to tactical errors. On Okinawa, loudspeaker teams achieve something unprecedented. Approximately 2% of Japanese defenders eventually surrender, nearly 7 times the Iwo Jima rate. The reason isn't better propaganda. It's that Okinawa's battle lasts 82 days, long enough for psychological conditioning to erode, for hope to die, for survival instinct to overwhelm ideology. The Okinawa civilians present a different story. Loudspeaker teams broadcasting in Okinawan dialect achieve significant success, convincing civilians to leave combat zones and seek safety. Thousands of Okinawan civilians survive because of these broadcasts. But the distinction is critical. Civilians aren't soldiers. They haven't been ideologically conditioned. They haven't sworn oaths. They can respond to rational self-interest in ways that Japanese military personnel simply cannot. The psychological warfare specialists learn a brutal lesson. Culture isn't window dressing. It's not just about translation accuracy or cultural sensitivity in messaging. When you're facing an enemy for whom death in battle is literally preferable to survival in captivity, not as rhetoric but as genuine belief system, psychological warfare as conceived has almost no utility. Captain Daniel Lerner, now stationed in the Pacific after 2 years in Europe, writes in his after-action report, "We have developed sophisticated techniques for exploiting doubt. But what do you do when there is no doubt? When the enemy is absolutely certain, beyond question, that surrender is unacceptable? We can't create doubt where certainty is total." The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki accomplish what no amount of loudspeaker broadcasts could. They provide the emperor himself with a face-saving reason to order surrender. Not because of military defeat, Japan was already militarily defeated, but because of a new and terrible weapon against which no defense exists. Even then, significant factions of the Japanese military attempt a coup to prevent surrender. The announcement itself requires the emperor's personal radio address, the first time most Japanese citizens hear his voice. When Japanese forces finally surrender across the Pacific, psychological warfare units are standing by with loudspeakers to broadcast the emperor's message to isolated garrisons. And even then, some units refuse. Some continue fighting for months, believing the surrender announcement is Allied propaganda. The last Japanese soldier to formally surrender will do so in 1974, 29 years after the war ends, on an island in the Philippines. The war ends in 1945, but the loudspeakers don't stop broadcasting. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War confrontations. Every conflict that follows World War II features psychological warfare units with increasingly sophisticated equipment. But they're all chasing the same elusive goal, finding the magic words that convince enemies to stop fighting. And in doing so, they're building something that will outlive the loudspeakers themselves. A doctrine of information warfare, an understanding that battles are fought as much in soldiers' minds as on physical terrain. The legacy of those scratchy broadcasts across frozen fields and jungle clearings will shape how militaries think about warfare for the next 80 years. Not because psychological warfare is reliably effective, but because when it does work, when those white flags appear and lives are saved, it feels like magic, and humans can never resist the promise of magic. Iraq. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano stands next to what the U.S. Army now calls a Psychological Operations Tactical Loudspeaker System. It's digital. It's truck-mounted. It can broadcast in 12 languages. It has GPS targeting and can adjust volume and frequency based on atmospheric conditions. It's also, Romano admits, basically the same thing his grandfather used in World War II. Just with better speakers, he's about to broadcast surrender appeals to Iraqi Republican Guard positions outside Baghdad. He has sophisticated scripts written by psychological operations experts. He has cultural advisors. He has real-time intelligence. And he has exactly the same question his grandfather had 60 years ago. Is this actually going to work? The loudspeakers of World War II planted seeds that grew in unexpected directions. The immediate post-war period saw psychological warfare professionalized, The U.S. Army established the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg in 1952, later Fort Liberty. Academic programs studied wartime propaganda effectiveness. Technical specifications improved. Doctrine was formalized. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. How do you reliably change minds at scale? Korea became the next testing ground. United Nations forces deployed loudspeakers extensively along the 38th parallel. The results were mixed. Chinese and North Korean forces generally ignored broadcasts. When they did surrender, it was usually due to being surrounded and out of ammunition, with loudspeakers playing a minimal role. The exception was during the final months of the war, when Chinese soldiers, increasingly aware that armistice negotiations were underway, became more receptive to surrender appeals. The key variable wasn't the quality of propaganda. It was whether soldiers believed the war was ending anyway. If they thought they might die in the final days of a concluded conflict, surrender appeals provided permission to act on self-preservation instincts. Vietnam represented a different challenge entirely. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army weren't a conventional force you could surround and offer terms. Loudspeaker teams found themselves broadcasting to empty jungles, unsure if anyone was listening. The famous Wandering Soul tapes represented a psychological warfare evolution, or devolution. American units broadcast recordings of wailing voices, supposed to represent spirits of unburied Vietnamese dead. The theory: exploit Buddhist beliefs about ancestor veneration and proper burial. The reality: it terrified some Vietnamese civilians. It enraged Viet Cong forces. It probably strengthened rather than weakened enemy resolve. And it represented a return to the purely terroristic approach the Soviets used on the Eastern Front: psychological warfare as torture rather than persuasion. But here's what did work in Vietnam. Chio Hoi, Open Arms program. Not primarily a loudspeaker operation, but loudspeakers played a role. The key difference: Chio Hoi offered defection, not just surrender. Return to South Vietnam, reintegration, amnesty, specific, verifiable benefits. Over 200,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers defected through Chio Hoi. Many first learned about the program through loudspeaker broadcasts. The difference from World War II surrender appeals? Time. Defectors often heard broadcasts for months before acting. Loudspeakers planted ideas that germinated slowly. The lesson: psychological warfare is strategic, not tactical. It doesn't change minds in hours. It changes them over weeks or months of repeated messaging combined with deteriorating combat conditions. The Cold War saw psychological warfare go electronic. Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, Radio Liberty. These were loudspeakers broadcasting to entire nations, trying to shape opinions across the Iron Curtain. Did they contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse? Impossible to measure definitively. But Soviet efforts to jam broadcasts suggest they were considered threatening. Then came the digital age. The Gulf War in 1991 saw the last major use of traditional loudspeakers. Coalition forces dropped 29 million leaflets and broadcast hundreds of hours of programming to Iraqi forces. Over 80,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered, many citing coalition psychological operations as a factor. But notice the shift: leaflets dropped by aircraft, capable of reaching entire army groups, radio broadcasts that Iraqi soldiers could hear on their own radios. The loudspeaker, limited to line of sight, requiring physical proximity, was becoming obsolete. By Iraq 2003 and Afghanistan, psychological operations went digital. Radio broadcasts via commandeered local stations, SMS text messages to enemy commanders' cell phones, social media campaigns, hacked email accounts, digital billboards in urban areas. The loudspeaker persisted, but as a secondary tool, used mainly for crowd control, curfew announcements, and evacuation instructions to civilians, not for frontline surrender appeals. Why? Because modern warfare doesn't have front lines like World War II, no sustained positions facing each other across no man's land, no sieges lasting weeks where defenders can be worn down by repeated messaging. Instead, fluid, mobile warfare where enemies might be gone before loudspeaker teams arrive. And because information moves differently now, a soldier with a smartphone has access to news, social media, messaging. Propaganda must compete with infinite information sources. The isolated soldier in a foxhole, dependent on official channels for information, no longer exists. But the doctrine born from World War II loudspeaker experiments lives on. Every modern influence campaign, military or otherwise, follows principles discovered through trial and error in Sicily, Italy, the Ardennes, and the Pacific. 1. Accuracy is credibility. False propaganda is quickly exposed and strengthens enemy resolve. The truth, delivered strategically, is more powerful. 2. Repetition over time. Single messages rarely change minds. Consistent messaging over extended periods gradually shifts perceptions. 3. Psychological readiness. Propaganda is most effective on audiences already questioning their situation. It provides permission and rationalization, not initial motivation. 4. Cultural specificity matters. Messages must align with target audiences' values, language, and worldview. Generic appeals fail. 5. Tactical intelligence enhances strategic messaging. Accurate, specific, timely information proves you know their situation better than their own commanders. 6. Music and emotion access cognition differently than rational argument. Nostalgia, fear, hope. These bypass critical thinking and affect decision-making. 7. Source credibility is everything. Who delivers the message matters as much as content. These principles now apply to political campaigns using micro-targeted social media, disinformation operations shaping public opinion, counter-terrorism, messaging to potential extremists, public health campaigns encouraging behavior change, corporate marketing, and brand management. The loudspeakers of World War II were crude tools, but they were laboratories. Every broadcast was an experiment in persuasion, conducted under maximum stress with life or death stakes. The data generated, surrender rates, effectiveness metrics, psychological observations formed the foundation of modern influence operations. Today, Russia's Internet Research Agency, China's 50 Cent Army, American Strategic Communications Operations. These are the descendants of Staff Sergeant Martin Selling standing on a Sicilian mountainside, hoping his voice would save lives. The equipment changed, the scale changed, the medium changed, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you convince someone to act against their apparent self-interest, their social conditioning, their group loyalty? Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can't. And the factors that determine success remain frustratingly difficult to predict or control. In 2023, Ukrainian psychological operations teams deploy loudspeakers along front lines, broadcasting surrender appeals to Russian forces. The messages are sophisticated, delivered in regional dialects, offering specific benefits. Some Russian soldiers surrender citing these messages. Most don't. The loudspeakers are accompanied by telegram channels with surrender instructions, text messages to Russian soldiers' phones, QR codes in leaflets linking to web portals, encrypted chat channels for secure communication, multi-channel psychological warfare, converging on the same objective. The loudspeaker is one tool among many, but it persists, because sometimes, in the chaos and fear of combat, a human voice speaking from speakers has power that digital text lacks: immediacy, presence, the intimacy of sound. Klaus Huber, the German soldier who surrendered on Mount Etna after hearing Martin Selling's broadcast, lived to 83. In his final interview, recorded by his granddaughter in 2007, he reflected on that morning. "I was going to die that day. I was certain. And then this voice comes from nowhere, speaking German like my uncle spoke, telling me I could live, could see my family again, could survive. I don't know if it was propaganda or truth, but I know I heard it, and I walked out with my hands up, and I lived. So whatever it was, it worked." That's the legacy. Not the equipment, not the doctrine, not the theories. The simple fact that sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, words carried on sound waves could convince a terrified soldier that surrender was possible, that survival was acceptable, that laying down arms didn't mean betraying everything you believed in. And in those moments, when white flags appeared across no man's land and lives were saved, the scratchy loudspeakers accomplished something profound. They turned the tools of war toward the goal of peace. Even if just for a few men, even if just for a day, it was enough.